welcome everybody to this one of the regular Zoom events for the Bristol Civic Society. I'm Sandra Fryer, the chair of the Civic Society, and I'm chairing this event this evening. So welcome. But without further ado, I want to go on to this meeting this evening when we're talking about planning and building of Hartcliffe. And we're going to hear from Paul Smith, who has been involved in civic life in the city for more than 3 decades. I first met Paul as a very youthful councillor, but he's gone on to much bigger and perhaps greater things. He may not agree with me on that. In particular, now being the Group Chief Executive of Elim Housing Association, as well as being a trustee of the Chartered Institute of Housing and the Andrews Charitable Trust. Paul grew up in Hartcliffe and has extensively researched the history of the area, and his talk will cover the Hartcliffe story and why it's important to Bristol's history and how the original plans were degraded during construction, and in his book Betrayed. For any of you who haven't got a copy, here's his book Betrayed, and I've faithfully read it, in particular because I'm really interested in the Garden City and Newtown movement, and interested in the fact that this was essentially called a new town, one of several new neighbourhoods envisioned in the late 1940s, 50s for Bristol. But actually, as we'll hear from Paul, that journey didn't always unfold in the way that it was first envisioned. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Paul, and thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you and the team for inviting me to indulge myself in talking about about Hartcliffe. And what I hope to be able to do is explain why it's important. The issues are important to Bristol and important now as well, even though they relate to things that started to happen 80 years ago. So I'm going to try and share my screen.
Sorry, I omitted to say, if any of you would like to ask questions, please will you write your questions in the chat, and I will gather up the chats as we go through and ask the questions at the end. And after that, there may be a chance for general questions. Sorry, Paul, back again.
Sandra, is it on?
Yes, it's on, but not on full screen.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So it seems to be full screen on my computer, so I don't know what else I can do. I guess firstly, I just want to say a little bit about why I think this is important, because actually the growth of and the development of Hartcliffe is also about the growth of the city as a whole. Growing up in the area, I always felt that we weren't part of the city. When I looked at things about the history of Bristol, it was always about the central area. And I must admit, I was most upset when I read the Punter book on development in Bristol between the 40s and the 90s, where there was only one mention of housing estates, as if they weren't important, and all that it was worth talking about probably was building in the centre and the Broadmead area. Also, I think that there are lessons from the post-war period that we need to learn now. There's more talk again about urban extensions and new towns, and it's really important that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that were made, not just in Hartcliffe, but across the whole country. Now, I'm going to try and share a video with you. This video is I was really excited to get this. I got this after I wrote the book. It's from the archives, and it's a video which the map that's shown in there is of Hartcliffe, and basically what they're talking about is why they needed to build the estate, and actually has some footage of the estate being built. So, oops, I've gone. These things aren't always as easy to work as you would like. Let's have a look. There it is. So very very short, but I really love it. It does say 1950s to you very clearly. So, firstly, is the title right? Is it just a catchy title? In some ways, it is. I mean, I wanted it to stand out from other books that are about local areas, which tend to be a collation of pictures without any real context in terms of the sort of socio-economic times. Here, I want to share with you two quotes. The first one is from the Western Daily Press just before the estate was built. It was reporting on the planning committee, which actually agreed the plans for the estate. And as you can see, when finally the garden city arises, it will be a venture of which Bristol will be justly proud. Then Michael Jenner, who I'm sure some of you may have known when he was more active within the city, um, describes Hartcliffe not as a garden city that would be justly proud, but of the worst instance of building everywhere, in the city. And it concludes, as you can see, by saying almost every big mistake which can be made in the design of a housing estate was made at Hartcliffe. So something happened between 1950 and 1988 from it being something we should be proud of to something which had every big mistake within it. I mean, Hartcliffe was born out of a dispute after the war. The council wanted to extend its boundaries quite significantly, and in the map with the city of Bristol in the middle, you can see that it was very ambitious in terms of how much it wanted to take. And it wasn't just Bristol. A lot of cities, Plymouth, Coventry, and others, and even Cheltenham, were looking to extend their boundaries for post-war development. The government set up a boundary commission nationally to deal with a restructure of local government. I think it hit the buffers quite quickly after just over a year. The commission was wound up, and they said instead of these ambitious plans to expand cities, what they would do, or what they encouraged cities to do, was to negotiate with the surrounding authorities to get mutually agreed extensions of boundaries. And there's quite a big story. It's in the book about the to-ing and fro-ing between Bristol and Somerset, and the resistance from areas not wanting to come into the city. Personally, I think the city would have been a lot better if it had adopted the boundaries that you can see. But the deal that was done was that the what's called the Dundry Slopes area, Dundry Slopes housing area, basically Hartcliffe and Withywood incorporating Bishopsworth village, plus a little bit of what's now Stockwood and a little bit of Ashton, where the school is at Ashton, came into the city boundary. But Bristol also succeeded some of its boundary, which is a story that's very rarely told. Portishead Docks were within Bristol. Bits of Clevedon, Ham Green were given back to Somerset, were swapped. So if you go into, you won't see this, if you go into M Shed, it sort of shows the city growing and growing and growing. What it never shows is this level of retrenchment where Bristol swapped land with Somerset. What the government then said is, because Bristol had done this land swap with Somerset, its ambitions in Gloucestershire were then cancelled. Like, you can only do one deal every 10 years. And Bristol's boundary has stayed since 1951 to the boundary it has now, which incorporates the Hartcliffe estate as the largest part of that boundary extension. So you saw the little video about the post-war reconstruction. Obviously, there was a lot of damage bomb damage within the city. There was also population growth, And so Bristol, like a whole range of other cities, was looking at how it rebuilt. Now, the government adopted in 1944 a REBA approach to building neighbourhoods, which was that you would have um, probably an area, a population of about 5,000 people. That would be enough to sustain a primary school. If you had two areas of 5,000, that would be enough to sustain a secondary school. And that, as you can see in this map, which comes from basically a Bristol City Council document, although it was published by Fry's, that Bristol was going to have these areas built around the city, which would have shops and recreation in the middle, houses around them, and then ring roads linking it all up, and also industry next to it. And Hartcliffe was the sort of exemplar in some respects of this sort of vision of these neighbourhood units. And in the original plans, there were a lot of new facilities planned. So on this map, the purple on the first map is a secondary school. It's a very low rise secondary school because it's very close to the airport and you couldn't build too high. Then there's a primary school in green. Within the secondary school, there's also sports pavilion, youth centre, a cafe for the local community to go. And then you also add that shopping centre, which is the purple in this one is the shops. The orange is the library. The library wasn't built until open until 1973. So this is a plan from 1950. The red is a cinema, which was never built, and the blue is a swimming pool that was never built. Also, next to the swimming pool, also a whole range of sports facilities, which were linked into the community centre in front of it, and those sports facilities were never provided either. In fact, where the swimming pool and the cinema were planned to be, eventually the council built high-rise flats. And in terms of the vision, these are two articles from the Bristol Post. The first one is from 1945 and talks about how the new homes must be of a higher standard. And with particular emphasis on men returning from the war, this sort of homes for heroes type approach that had been exemplified after the First World War, also being talked about after the Second World War. By 1951, you've got the council agreeing a plan of building cheaper council houses, of a much lower quality, of building concrete housing rather than brick, reducing the room sizes, reducing the ceiling heights. There was even a suggestion, which wasn't taken up, that instead of having of a downstairs wall separating the living spaces, that maybe you could just put up curtains. And so the vision of what was going to be produced, it wasn't just about facilities not being built, it was also about a lower quality of housing. And by the early 1980s, most of the housing that was built in Hartcliffe was actually condemned under the 1984 Housing Defects Act, which says the housing was not mortgageable, was not of a good standard, and the council actually had to effectively rebuild all the housing which had been sold up to that date under the right to buy. We often talk about stigma and council estates, and it was almost like Hartcliffe was stigmatized before it was even built. Originally, the plan was that the estate would be called New Dundry. Very, very quickly, the people of Dundry were opposing that. They said there might be some confusion, but I think it was very much that they really didn't want to be associated with a council estate. And so, after correspondence with the town or with the village parish council at Dundry, the council decided to look for another name. The name they came up with was from the old medieval hundred, which covered the area, which was the hundred of Hartcliffe. And there's a lovely 1950s picture of Herbert Harris, who not only named Hartcliffe, but named in across the 30s and the 50s, pretty much every council house estate, every road in the city. The building of the estate itself was problematic. It's built on the side of a hill, and the hill it's got a lot of natural springs in it coming down, and so if you talk to and you read remembrances of people who originally moved there, what they all talk about is the mud. The mud was a problem when they were building the estate, partly also because the council ripped out pretty much all of the trees and hedgerow and everything that was holding things together. So every time it rained, quite a lot of mud was just washed down the hill. And so building the estate was quite difficult. And also when people first moved in, the estate was built without pavements. People had to sort of walk through the mud. It was also the roads weren't fully developed, so people had to often walk across fields to get to the bus and public transport systems in other parts of Bristol, so in Bishopsworth and Whitchurch, to be able actually to get into the city. And there were no jobs in Hartcliffe, so that they were getting buses into the, walking across a muddy field, getting a bus to work, working all day, then a bus back, and then across the muddy fields again. No shops until 3 or 4 years after the estate was built. So also people had to leave the estate to get food, or rely on the mobile services that would drive into the area. Just a sort of bit of a vignette of a story, and also to say, things haven't changed or weren't as great in the past as people think. This idea that there was fantastic community spirit, and everybody got on, and everybody worked together, and everybody's doors were open, and they all came in and helped each other. People started moving in 1953. A community association was set up. It started organising events. It planned to build its own community centre, because at that time, whilst the council made land available and planned for a community centre, it refused to build it. It said it had to be built by voluntary effort by the local community. So after going to across the field on the bus to work, then back again, then they were expected in the evenings to build the community centre, and they started fundraising. Interestingly, quite a lot of the events arranged to raise funds for the community centre actually lost money, and quite a lot of different reasons were given why people weren't coming to the dances that were organised. So you had the first one, which wasn't successful, was blamed on that there was a smoking ban, because the concert was held in the first school. So then they managed to petition the council and get the council to agree to remove the smoking ban. And then they held the next one, and they had exactly the same problem. So then they blamed the television for the reason why people weren't coming out. And then there were various periods where the community association actually almost collapsed because of a lack of people being involved, and people being involved probably not getting on with each other that well. They did keep going. They started door-to-door collections of subscriptions. They organised a number of events. Those of you interested in planning, they did organise an event for planners to come and organise a conference in Hartcliffe about the planning of the estate. The people who came along were not very supportive of the people who were speaking, and the reports in the media at the time were quite interesting about uh, the disputes and the arguments from people. And there's actually a line from the chair of planning who at the end says basically, I hear that you're not very happy with how we're building the estate, but at least it'll be better than Noel West, which I don't think is a ringing endorsement either of Hartcliffe or of Noel West. So they start building the community centre in 1956, and then it suffers with vandalism, and that obviously makes people quite disheartened. Every time they make a bit of progress, somebody comes and smashes it up. And as I said, there are issues around this, will it disband? Will it keep going? Is there enough people? Every now and again, it's threatened to be closed, then people turn up again. And all those issues with vandalism, which are all documented through the Bristol Post. And it keeps trying to find ways to keep going. In the end, you end up with two organizations on the estate, an organization of professionals and an organization of local residents. Now, interestingly, then a lot of the professionals lived on the estate, because the two sort of leading lights of that group was a Dr. Leonard, who and the doctors actually had large houses with their sort of surgery space on the ground floor. They would live upstairs, and then they would meet people on the ground floor of their properties. And the local vicar, who also was involved in running a community newspaper and stuff. And they only really managed to build the community centre and get it going when those two organisations merged, when you brought together the professionals and the residents. But the main thing that made the difference to building the community centre was actually that the council in 1959 removed the requirement that it had to be built through voluntary labour. And so basically they bought a prefab and stuck it there, and that's where it first started. And I've actually, presented a different version of this presentation, but about the book actually in the community centre, which is still there. And once it got going, it was funded effectively through bar loans. So there you are. That you can see a picture of what it looked like when it was first opened. The other thing I just wanted as another vignette just to mention was the school. Originally, if you remember that original plan, the school was a low-rise building. In 1956, it was agreed that the Whitchurch Airport, which was then the Bristol Airport, would close and move to Lulsgate Bottom. And then, of course, the airport was called Lulsgate Airport for as long as I can remember, until suddenly decided to call it Bristol International Airport. The original that then allowed for them to use much more of the site, because the height restrictions removed, and to build taller buildings. And the original plan, which is, or the 1956 plan, as opposed to the 1950 plan, was to build a boys' school and a girls' school. Now, the first school that was built as the estate started to populate wasn't a boys' school; it was a mixed school. But the idea was then that a second building would be built, which would be a separate girls' school. And there you can see on this picture much more clearly that there's definitely a boys and girls separate schools. And he actually says on here a future girls school. There then became a big campaign led by Reverend Palmer, who was a big mover and shaker in the early days of the estate, to actually have a co-educational school. and rather than a boys and a girls. And it took a couple of years, but that campaign was won, and it became quite a political campaign with the Citizen Party, which was a sort of merger of the Conservatives and the Liberals in Bristol, wanting a separate boys and girls school. Originally, they wanted a secondary modern and a grammar school. But they wanted a boys and a girls school, and Labour wanting uh, a mixed school aligned with the local campaign, and that in the end that was successful, that campaign. So you had one school but with two buildings, and in what was going to be the girls' school, you had all of the what were called home economics labs, and in the other school, which was going to be the boys' school, you had the metalworking and woodworking spaces. So there were differences between the two sites, but they were not a separate boys and girls school. The other thing from that 1956 plan of the schools is actually, which I actually find quite interesting, it might be a future piece of work that I do, was the proposal to build a hospital in the area. A hospital wasn't built until after into this millennium, so over 50 years after the suggestion of hospital. And what was finally built was more of a geriatric hospital than a local hospital to serve South Bristol, which was what was originally proposed. So another one of those facilities that drifted away and out of sight. So this was just a quick run through. Obviously, there's a lot more detail and a lot more colour, with a lot of contemporary comments from people from the estate as it was being built in the book. If you haven't got a copy, which obviously I'd be very shocked about, you can buy it directly from the Bristol Radical History Group, along with lots of other really interesting books. I'd certainly recommend. I'm sure a lot of people in the Civic Society will be really interested in the book they've recently published on swimming pools in Bristol. Um, I'm now working on two other books, one about the slum clearances of the 1930s and the building of Knoll West, and also another book on Hartcliffe in the 80s and 90s. And also to flag up to you, a free event that's coming up in April at MShed is the Radical History Festival, where one of the themes of that event will be housing, with some local speakers, probably yours truly, and also some national speakers to talk about housing, not just in Bristol but across the country. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour. If I was going to say, what are the messages of this? Firstly, it's not helped the area that the facilities that were originally promised were not built. And if we're looking at building new towns, and actually real new towns fared a lot better in terms of the provision of facilities, then we need those facilities to be built, as well as building as many homes as possible. Also, it's sort of incredibly important that you don't just put one social group into an area, that you have mixed communities. And one of the things, again, in the literature that you'll see that Hartcliffe suffered from was that it was a very small demographic range, and people with less spending power, which, as we go into the 80s and 90s, you see shops, pubs and everything else closing because there isn't enough wealth in the community to keep them together. And so instead of being a 15-minute neighborhood, it's a neighborhood which is 45 minutes from the facilities it needs on the bus, at some expense, moving into the city. And we need to learn those lessons for the new urban extensions and new towns that are going to be built. The other thing, just to reflect, when I launched this book on the estate. The other thing where we had quite a lot of debate and discussion was the lack of any democratic infrastructure in building the estate. There was no parish council or town council, so you had a new area being built quite distant from the city centre, but with no real authority over its future. Decisions all being made in what seemed like a very distant local authority. And if you go to Hartcliffe today, and other estates as well, I'm sure, they feel that they're very distant from where decisions are made, and there's very little decision making made at a local level. And I think a very strong case for having urban parish councils across the city to give communities like this one, but all communities within the city, more power and authority over their own future and the development of the areas. So with that, I will stop sharing and hope that you haven't all left, because I can't see any of you at the moment.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was brilliant and gave us lots of food for thought, I'm sure. I'm looking to see if there are any questions in the chat, and there aren't at the moment. There was a comment from Ted Fowler, who, of course, you will know. He has had to leave the call, but he was, I think, interested to see whether you were going to make any contribution about the characters, the political leaders who helped through the emergent from the 50s to, in my career experience, to the 2000s, really. And he was thinking then in particular of people like Michael Cox, who campaigned long and hard for the Hartcliffe area. Yeah, and I'd also like you to talk a bit more about isolation. And in my career, I put in place, I met young people in Hartcliffe who didn't have a local shop to go and buy presents for their friends for birthdays or whatever, and they didn't know how to get to the city centre. They never went there. So something about how we plan new places.
So that it's a really interesting thing how few people went to the centre of Bristol, felt any ownership over the centre of Bristol, and at various times people have been involved in that. In terms of the politics at the time, actually there were two interesting political characters, both aldermen, which means they didn't have to be elected, because at that time there was a top up to the people who were elected to the council, who were the aldermen. Alderman Gill, who for quite a long period was the chair of housing in Bristol, and Alderman Hennessy, who for quite a long period was the chair of planning. And Alderman, they were both obviously Labour politicians, because for most of the period, although there's the period, for instance, when the housing designs were reduced, was at Bristol was under citizen control, was that in today's speak, Alderman Gill would be seen to be a sort of an old-fashioned right-winger trade unionist, and Alderman Hennessy was much more on the left of the party, and there was conflict between the two of them. I think Alderman Hennessy very much held to the vision of the estate, whereas Alderman Gill was very much about, how can we reduce the cost per unit of the facilities and things that were there. So they were the two dominant political characters of the period when the estate was built. And if I don't know how he managed it, but the health centre was the Mary Hennessy Health Centre when it was originally built, and I did some digging, because she's not somebody who comes up very often. Even if you, for instance, look at the books, The Women Who Built Bristol, which are now 3 volumes, she doesn't get mentioned. The only mention I could find of her was that she was a councillor, and she was the wife of Alderman Hennessy. So the one he did manage to get something named after his wife.
So there's a couple of questions and comments in the chat. One from Angela, which asked that question, where did the first residents come from? And I'd actually like to expand that to think about, where do people come from who move into Hartcliffe? Because I know it's been an area of very slow change and doesn't reflect the city as much as some other parts.
So originally, a lot of the people who moved into Bristol came from the central city, places like St Philip's, Barton Hill, and one of the reasons we know that people came from Barton Hill, apart from some of the memory groups that were running in the 80s, people talked about where they came from beforehand, is actually the Barton Hill settlement moved a social worker into Hartcliffe for several years, funded by Bristol University, to support the people who'd moved from Barton Hill into Hartcliffe. In terms of the sort of demographics or homogeneity of the estate, what you would find is in the 50s, to get a property on the waiting list, you had to have lived in Bristol for donkey's years, to get to the highest point, and so it almost excluded anybody who wasn't a lifetime white Bristolian. So you ended up with the council estates actually being very, very white, even when in the 50s and 60s you had a lot of immigration into the city from other communities, particularly in the first instance from the African Caribbean community. There are hardly anybody who weren't white British on the estate, and it's still an issue now that those estates are largely white indigenous Bristolians, and it's quite difficult when people from other cultures move there being accepted and integrated into the area. And Hartcliffe would have had one of the highest Brexit votes in the city, for example, and one of the highest UKIP votes as well from the people who bothered to vote. Actually, you're at a stage now where only about 15% of the people in Hartcliffe voted in the last local elections, compared to over 40% across the city as a whole, and over 60% in some of the wealthier areas of the city, because people do not feel that the short amount of time you need to spend, you take voting, actually is meaningful enough to spend it doing it.
Okay, Paul, there's another question, changing the subject if we may, which is about transport and accessibility. Helen Thomas says that her parents came to Norwest in 1938 as a subject for your future book, and said that they were shown developments in Essex, but noted that when they moved here there were similar errors: no community facilities, narrow socioeconomic demography, but really bad public transport links, and therefore the isolation was increased. Do you have any thoughts about how we can avoid that going forward?
Well, tram system would help, wouldn't it, for the city? But having really good public transport. And interestingly, if you look at both Hartcliffe and Knoll West, and Southmead and Lawrence Weston and the Royal Rangers, they were built on the assumption that people wouldn't own cars. So with like quite narrow roads, but with sort of spine roads through them, which would bring both deliveries in, but would also be the main bus routes. But from Hartcliffe, the bus system now is quite expensive. It's not particularly reliable. It takes about 45 minutes to get into the centre of Bristol. And so people, the transport system is one of the isolators of that area. And it's interesting. I was in Vienna in July last year, and they're building a big new estate. And you remember in Vienna, most of the new stuff that's built is still council or social housing. They're building a new estate on what was an old Russian airfield on the outskirts of Vienna, and they built the metro link before they built a single house.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a lot of lessons to learn, don't we, from European planned growth developments about the order in which to do things. There's some other questions about who will we build houses for today and going forward, and that question of whether you could throw some light on how are we more likely to achieve urban growth areas with a greater mix of community in new neighbourhoods, or are the housing needs such that there will be more repetition of the past? I think it's a complicated one to balance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer in mixed communities. And when I was responsible for housing in Bristol, I was trying actually to bring more private housing into Hartcliffe, because I felt it needed a little bit of gentrification, to be honest. But I mean, I live on an estate which is in South Gloucestershire, and we've got 30% social housing and 70% housing for sale. It might be that, 50-50 might be better, but actually having that mix, I think, is really important. And you're not going to have thriving neighborhoods if you haven't got people from a big range of backgrounds. When we talk about diversity, if you want community organizations, you want people with all sorts of experience coming into those organizations and those communities. And whether, if you build areas that are just for wealthy or just educated people, and you build other areas which are just for people who need social housing, I think you're not going to get the social mix that's going to make places really successful. And if you look at some of the most successful communities in Bristol, when Bristol does its surveys on happiness and everything else, places like Easton and Southfield, you'll find that those areas have got a very, very wide social mix.
There's another question, and it's one that comes up, I think, quite a lot. And, as we see planned growth areas, we hear a lot of conversations around engaging residents and in helping and listening to local people's views or future residents and what they'd like to see in their place. Can you reflect with us about engagement with local people and whether people had an opportunity to influence what was being built, etc.?
No, there was well, back in the 50s. No, there was no, community engagement wasn't really a thing. It was, and you can understand why. I mean, they started planning for the expansion of Bristol in 1943. The war was still going on, and it was a crisis, but it was recognised as a crisis. We talk about the housing crisis now, but we don't behave in a crisis way, and so it was. People need houses. We'll just build lots of houses, and they built flats as well. And they had. There's been a lot of work done, as I say. Reba produced a document in about the same time in the early 40s about neighbourhood units and the best way to organise areas, very similar to the discussions about the 15-minute neighbourhood now. That was adopted by government and was just sort of imposed as a model. And interesting, I can't remember her name, but I was reading um, a critique of the neighbourhood model, of the Garden City model, by a Syrian writer. And what she said was the problem is that we were trying to impose community on people rather than let community develop. And actually, where you bring people together and create community, that's likely to be much more successful. And obviously, that can be done through models like community land trust type models, where you actually get a group of people together to plan an area. But that tends to be in this country on very, very small scale. But in places like Germany and France, you can get those sort of community models operating at a sort of a much bigger scale, and getting people to plan their own communities, including looking at how they might provide the social facilities themselves as well, as part of the planning of the area.
It's interesting, my experience with Absolute Garden City. The house building went apace, but we did put in quite early on a community forum, and we encouraged local people to come forward to join in, and they were able to start bringing forward the issues, their concerns, and help shape the new community centres and influence a bit the schools. Although we were building everything out in parallel because the funding package was quite different to what we see in many other places.
Yeah. And I think you could argue sometimes people aren't always right. We have to look at what works. One of the issues about Hartcliffe and some of the other garden cities is true of Noah West, and so is the density is too low, and that makes it very difficult to sustain a whole range of community facilities and shops and all the rest of it. And again, if you look at the places of the city which has managed to sustain those sorts of areas, they tend to be, quite high density terraced streets, with not with probably quite small gardens, but good parks. And we need to look at that Victorian model. Probably worked much more effectively and is working much more effectively now than the Garden City model did in terms of making economically and socially sustainable communities.
There are some really innovative housing solutions out there, aren't
Mm,
there, which we could use in future developments,
mm,
stacked housing,
mm,
higher, medium density, medium height, but mixed
mm,
use. We're getting lots of, thank you so much, Paul. This has been a great presentation being said here.
mm.
I'm going to ask now if anyone would particularly like to speak. I'm going to struggle to see when you put your hand up, but if there is anyone who wants to directly ask Paul any questions, do I think speak up now. I've got a different version of Zoom to what I'm used to. It's a bit all over the place tonight. Is there anyone who would like to say anything? Maybe put your hand up if you can, and I'll probably see it. Maybe not. So
Sorry, I just had a quick look in the chat, Sandra. The question about Knoll West did precede Hartcliffe, and one of the reasons I want to look at it, I mean, my parents were in Hartcliffe. My father originated in Knoll West. His parents, my grandparents, were moved there as part of the slum clearances in the 30s. There was a really interesting piece of work done by Bristol University where they actually had a researcher living in Knoll West for 6 months in the late 30s, before the war, and they wrote a research paper about what you should learn from these peripheral estates, what makes them work and what the problems are. That paper was completely ignored in the building of Hartcliffe later, and if the council had taken on some of the ideas within that, instead what the council did was suppress the report. They commissioned it, then suppressed it, and then it was published by the university after the war because the council wouldn't publish it.
The other thing that's interesting in the chat questions is the reminder that Knoll West did have a community centre, a
Yeah,
cinema, and a swimming
yeah.
pool. But of
Mm.
course, those
It's
facilities haven't
lost them. Yeah.
survived.
Mm.
And they haven't survived in part, probably because of what you said,
But
the domination of less well off communities, but the lower
mm,
density of living there as
yeah.
well.
So it's those two things:
Yeah,
the lack of economic power within those communities to
yeah.
keep those things going, and also the low density. I think those are both.
Mm.
If you look at where the swimming pools are still successful, they are some of those higher density areas or areas where there's more wealth in the community.
Mm. And I think that begins almost to nudge into the other question. That diagram you showed of planning the new zones, the new town, showed a band of employment land on the
Mm.
edge. I think many of us are actually worried that the employment sites in the city are being lost. And so, where will the jobs be? And will we be repeating in a different way that those problems again? That's for me a really big issue because the city needs those those businesses and services anyway.
Absolutely. Obviously, the nature of work is different. What was envisaged in the 40s was factories. And of
Mm,
course, Hartcliffe did have, for a very short period, you'd think it's much longer if you go to Shed. For a very short period, it did have a tobacco factory. And
mm,
now, where that tobacco factory is, you've got one of those soulless retail parks.
mm,
Um, but the the plan was for lots of factories at a time at which the country was
mm.
deindustrializing, or just before the country deindustrialized, unfortunately. But now, of course, work's different again. The extent to which people might work from home rather than going into an office. That many jobs that are around are office based rather than factory based. But we do need those jobs. And the fact, if you lived in Hartcliffe, you might have to go to Avonmouth or to Filton or to the centre of Bristol to work because there were never at any point where there are many jobs. So you're creating a dormitory, which also has an impact on local facilities.
We've got some comments now emerging about great presentation and volume house builders wouldn't do anything better, different, though, thought. And also the huge new debt. I'm not quite sure it is at Filton. I suppose it's the new development at Filton.
Mm,
Are we learning the lessons? My observation would be absolutely not, but I don't
mm.
know quite enough about it.
I noticed they've now relaunched it as if it's something completely new, but as a new town. Of course, it's got the shops at Cribbs Causeway, hasn't it? I must admit the place where I'm living now has got better facilities than Hartcliffe had at the same time in its life cycle.
Mm.
And also, where I live, I can get a metro bus into the centre of Bristol in 25 minutes. I can get into the centre of Bristol from South Gloucestershire much quicker than somebody from Hartcliffe can.
And I think that's because it was about mixed development, private sector led and negotiated through development. But well done, that scheme, but there are many around that aren't so good. Okay, I think unless there are any other questions, I think we should begin to draw this to a close. We've widened the discussion a bit. We've begun to think about future planning, future development in the wider Bristol area. I'm sure you'll come back and help us with future conversations, Paul.
I'd love to get involved with future conversations and say, if you haven't got it, you can get it. If the best place to order it is directly from the publishers online, and that in the £11, which is how much it costs, includes the postage. But there are quite a lot of the bookshops in Bristol are also carrying it. But then the publishers only get half the money. I don't get anything, by the way, because it's a charity. So
it's an interesting read. I'd recommend it for people who are interested in how Bristol grew and changed and what we didn't do, actually. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to say thank you very much, Paul, for coming tonight. It was brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone who's still on this call. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and we'll hopefully come forward with some follow-ups through the course of this year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.